Alright, hello again to anyone watching these Kaijudo videos. Today I am back with another deck profile. This time I'll be profiling my current monolight rush build. I guess you could call it more monolight aggro. It's not, maybe not rush in the traditional sense. Some of the similarities between this and rush are that it is a little bit more of an all-in type strategy. One of the downsides of being a monocolor deck is you're lacking a diversity of interaction or some of the better interactive tools. So you were kind of forced into playing that more linear, proactive game plan in the majority of your matchups. So that's kind of what lends it to the rush title, where it's just basically you're just going face and racing in every matchup. Now this deck has some more interesting features to it than a traditional rush deck, where with things like the blockers and the prism blade and other things going on, all the shield blasts, it gives it a little bit more, not just a little bit, a lot more defensive capability, which is what I think plays into the strength of the deck, which is that it's one of these aggressive decks that I think just trumps all the other ones. Like it just basically eats up and destroys all the other rush decks. It's really good even against other aggro-based decks, like a lot of the attacking decks. I think it has like a slight edge, like edges, not huge edges, but it has the edge. I think in a lot of like the like Bant tempo or light water nature tempo matchups, even water light decks. I think it has the slight edge. Um, Other matchups too, mono nature, like a lot of these kind of aggressive attacking matchups, this deck just has a lot of play and it's still fast enough to get under them while having, and then it just has all this extra defense out of nowhere with, again, the blasts and the prism blade, both versions, like the chasm entanglers too. There's just enough defense that you're able to take the aggressive role while still protecting yourself and making it really hard for the opponent to race you, which I think just makes it just a really powerful deck overall. Now, where it struggles, I think even more than traditional rush decks, is it has a little bit of a weaker game to, I think, especially darkness decks, Mesmerize, Bone Blades, Scared Orbital of Gloom Hollow decks and stuff like that. Like those decks can be a little bit more tough. Now, this version I think I've moved away from like the Evo heavy version with even playing Sparkblade Protectors. And I think felt like that approach just it kind of forced you into lines of play where you almost had to just drop this big Evo and you would just die to a Bone Blades a lot of the time. So maybe if you try to play around Bone Blades, your bait just gets removed anyways. Like it just, yeah, the deck was a little bit too weak. They mesmerize your power card and you don't have much going on. In my opinion, it was a little, it is still a little more troublesome against like those darkness based control decks. But you can still have a good game where you land a Keeper of Laws and then you sit back and you try to drop a Blinder Beetle to break through the board state. So trying to make up for that lack of like disruptive elements, the lack of Comet Missile and stuff, you could try to make up with a power card like Blinder Beetle Prime. So it's still kind of an all-in sort of aggressive deck, but it has a lot more tools to it than a traditional aggro or rush deck. So I think it's a little more up the aggro spectrum, but still, again, fast enough to get under a lot of stuff while it being just big enough to get over all the small stuff. So I think it's like a pretty well-positioned deck for certain metagames especially, but not maybe the most outright powerful deck in the format. So I can go over a lot of the card choices that I've made and maybe discuss along the way some of the cards I've omitted. So of course we have the package of 6 1-drops, Magus and Chasm. Chasm loses a little bit of value when I'm going down on evos, even stuff like Nova Cruiser or even Rodigale from back in Clash meta. Like those cards I don't think are worth playing at all, but if you wanted to play more evolution creatures, you could maybe go that route, and Chasm supports those, but I think it's still worth playing. Just being able to curve like an extra 1-mana card into your early game progressions, just giving you that bait to play like a Prism Blade on turn 4, I think is really good. Just like maybe you curve Magus, or even not Magus, you just play a 2-drop and then you can play a 2-drop plus Chasm on turn 3 and then you can evolve the Chasm on turn 4. There's a lot of ways you can just play the Chasm out on turn 1, do the same thing, 2-drop, 3-drop into 4-drop, and then just evolve on that Chasm. It's similar to how just, of course, the old like mono fire decks would always play what's it called, Jet Flame Bodyguard in there just to evolve on Drake into Dracon or Laser Arm Dracon at some point. So it's just a valuable card as a bait. Again, it loses some value without all the evolutions, but it's still good enough, and actually adds like a really nice defensive element to the deck too. Just when you're playing a lot of racing matchups, especially when you are a little bit slower, it's really nice to have this super cheap defensive play that you can make. Because when you're playing these racing matchups, they're high resource games. Both people are giving each other some extra resources out of shields, and you just want to have a bunch of cheap things that you can do, especially impactful things. And having a 1 mana interruption card like this, like a 1 mana way to protect a shield, is just really beneficial, because it sort of demands an answer from the opponent in order for them to keep their pressure going. Even in the early game too, beyond just that exchange, you can have it just protect your creatures in the early game to make attacks, playing a Magrus into a chasm and then using it to protect the chasm or the Magrus from something like a Cyber Scamp or Manapod Beetle, just to make that attack without your Magrus getting eaten. Those are nice play patterns to have. So I think the blocker does enough, and it can be a bit more of a situational card, but I think it's still nice to have in the deck. The 2-drop package, I think just pretty clear. We have Cloudwalker Drone, 2 for 2,500 a lot of the time, which is a really nice stat line. Prism Blade Enforcer, of course, just the mono light card here. 2 mana, 3,500. Everything I said about blocker is super relevant, and this is just a much bigger creature than a lot of the stuff in the early game as well. 3,500 power gets over a lot of these Shield Blast creatures too, things like Sumo Artichoke that might give you a hard time in the early game. Really nice to have access to this card. So just an amazing reason to be mono light. And then Luminous Shieldwing, we have just another great card. I mean, it's kind of a rare Enforcer 2-drop, so it's worth taking a look out for that reason alone. Just there's a lot of Enforcer 2-drops with weird abilities and stuff like that, but this one ends up being relevant a ton of the time. Just changing racing situations, has synergy here with Prism Blade, where you can you can just sit behind a Luminous Shieldwing and then give it blocker, and then your opponent, like if they attack, you just chump block and get a shield, and it prevents 2 attack. Like, it can be a really nice card and a really nice setup, especially when your opponent doesn't have removal for the Prism Blade. Luminous Shieldwing is just a really nice card. So we have Blinder Beetle here. Of course, I think the best 3-drop that you can play. Just make use of the big bodies that we have with Cloudwalker Drone and Prism Blade Enforcer. Just using those to dominate the early game, remove your opponent's creatures. Really valuable to have Blinder Beetle. On top of that, of course, removes a blocker from the equation for a turn, which can be really nice as kind of that sort of pseudo fast attack effect, if you want to call it that. So just pretty clearly the best 3-drop that you can play in the deck, and it's an Enforcer, of course, so slam dunk. Then we have Commissarsaurus and Superior Citadel Militia. These are some of the more speculative slots that I have right now. Saurus is a card I wanted to try more copies of, actually, and in the most recent iteration, or the previous iteration to this deck, I had 2 copies, and that list I think differed a bit. I think instead of the Salvation Reckoners, I had an extra Saurus, and I still had 2 Sparkblade Protectors, but I cut the Saurus and those Sparkblades to make room for these guys, which I think is the right call. But I still wanted to keep Saurus, and I could still see moving towards an extra copy or 2 even over these militias. I just really like how it can come down, gets the Cloudwalker Drone and Prism Blade Enforcer especially. It just, with those guys, like if you're in any kind of racing situation, it just makes it really easy to just play this as an Anthem effect and just answer your opponent's creatures really well. So I really like how it can just come down. I mean, your opponent has a tapped evolution, you can drop this and use yours to kill theirs, or a bunch of different things can go on with this card, letting your laws kill their laws. I just think it's nice to have access to. So I think 2 could be a little bit better of a version, or better to have access to, just so you can do that more consistently. But I have to test it to see how much it really comes up. So we'll see how that goes. But I like having the extra 2-drop anyways. I think like 10 2-drops is a nice number. And I could see wanting to go higher. Superior Citadel Militia. So this card probably requires a little more explanation. The reason I like it, of course, is just a Shield Blast creature is really nice, especially, again, in these racing matchups and all that sort of stuff. Just being able to drop an extra creature with 6 evolutions. Maybe it looks a little bit better when you're still playing Sparkblade Protector, but just having more stuff that you can drop out of nowhere out of your shields is really nice. And I think as far as like three mana cards are concerned, this is probably the best one you would include. But the question is more for me actually, just is it worth just playing more two drops instead of this card? And that's something I still have to figure out because, like, I think it's better than something like Citadel Judge, which would be the common inclusion. And this is a card I just don't like at all, to be honest. It can help maybe against the darkness decks that I talked about earlier that you struggle with. Ideally, like this card is a really nice way to deal with stuff like Gloom Hollow and Grudge Weaver and things like that, like the darkness blockers with Guard especially. But it just doesn't do that job consistently or well enough, or it's not even impactful enough in those scenarios. Moving away from Sparkblade Protector, you're maybe less vulnerable to Gloom Hollow anyways. Um, and especially when you're adding Salvation Reckoners like I am now. I just don't think I never really liked this card at all. It always felt like a liability, and I figured at some point I kind of came to the conclusion like I'd rather just have another 2-drop over this card, just to like I'd rather the upside of like never missing my 2-drop or being able to like even more consistently go double 2-drop on turn 4. I felt was like a bigger upgrade to the deck than having this like niche application or like this minor application to like remove a couple blockers from the equation or make an attack. Like Shock and Awe from like way back even to Dojo Edition, like it was never a card I was a fan of, and it always like underperformed in my opinion. So Citadel Judge, something I was fine to drop. And again, like the question for me now is more like, is Superior Citadel Militia just better than playing an extra 2-mana card? And I think you probably have enough 2-drops that it's kind of nice. It's probably worth just adding that upside of the Shield Blast. Because you can still play it as a cheap creature on turn 3, just like you would the other 2-drops. And 1500 power is like definitely probably going to be a downgrade to whatever 2-drop you're replacing it with. But again, you're probably not going to cast this card too much anyways. It's only if like you're missing a play and then it fills that hole. So it's still totally fine. Like it's not worse enough than any of these other cheap creatures unless you're like specifically lacking a 2-drop and you miss a play on turn 2. Like that's the worst case scenario when you're playing like a bad 3-drop like this, is that happens when this card is stuck in your hand. But for the most part, like you're just going to go 2-drop on turn 2 into 2-drop on turn 3, and this card's not enough worse than that 2-drop on turn 3 that I think it's worth like just upgrading that to the Shield Blast. And I think so far I've liked it. I've liked having that Shield Blast. It kind of helps, but it's sort of hard to measure, and I'm not sure where I'll come out on that at the end of the day. Like I said, I could see maybe even playing like a 2-2 split of this and Saurus, something like that, maybe making space for something else. We'll see how it goes. But I do like this card. Bottom line, I like this card better than the other 3-drop options, but maybe not better than another 2-drop. Keeper of Laws, of course, just standard. I mean, just really helps these kind of aggressive creature strategies. Gives you a threat that is very difficult to answer. Hexproof closes out games really easily. Makes it very difficult for your opponent to interact with your board. So just a slam dunk. Prism Blade is a card I really like. For me, this is one of the pieces of the puzzle that just completely annihilates any kind of these aggressive matchups, especially the ones that are low on interaction. Like if you're playing against Mono Nature, or like Mono Nature, like you have this Double Breaker, which is just great, and then on top of that, they're forced into answering it with their own evolution, which they're probably going to do anyways, but it just forces them to be on the back foot, because if they don't have the choice, because they can't race it by just like hoping they have a Shield Blast, or maybe even just like if they're already ahead in the race somehow, like maybe they want to break your shields to try to close out the game. But they're almost forced to answer this because you're just going to chump block with some other thing and then keep double breaking them. So like they have to. I mean, maybe that's not the most the best application for it, but I've just had lots of setups with this, like outside of just against rush decks, like even against like water light decks where like it's kind of difficult, like where they have to bounce this to the hand and then you get to just replay it, so they're never actually getting that far ahead on tempo, and you just get to keep dropping this because like they have to Rusalka this thing, which maybe they'd want to do, but like they can't Rusalka like a Keeper of Laws, right? So they have to hit this, or if you have multiple creatures out, like it's just they can't bounce all the cards that would get blockers, so it just makes it really tough to deal with the boards in a lot of ways, in the ways that your opponent would want to. And against like Firelight Rush, Fire Nature Rush, like Mono Fire, like all those fire-based rush decks that are full of fast attacks, this card just basically auto wins. Um, just putting up a blocker, just like you can sit behind an untapped Shield Wing and then just give it blocker when they attack, and then like either it just brick walls their whole board because they don't want to attack because it's super unprofitable, or like you just chump block something and then they have to trade off. Like they don't have any easy answers, and rush decks just can't really afford to play answers to this card. There aren't even any good ones. Like if they're playing a monocolor deck or even Firelight or Fire Nature, like there's just not really answers to this card, unfortunately for them. Like even if you wanted to play a different removal spell that wasn't just Ashen Tribute or Comet Missile, we don't have like a card like Volcanic Arrows in this game. So like you can't, like it would be something like Laser Eyes or Tornado Flame, which are already kind of mediocre cards, and those just can't deal with this kind of threat. And so this card just, for me, it just auto wins the matchup. And I think it's much better than something like Sparkblade Protector, where I think the blocker tag can be nice, but I think it's just worse because like you're just going to be attacking with the evolution anyways. Like if you're sitting back, you just get blown out by a Comet Missile, and just having this card, it lets you be proactive and defensive at the same time. So if they ever can't answer it, it's just amazing, because it just makes it impossible to race you. Blinder Beetle Prime, just an amazing card. It's a little expensive. It can be a little bit clunky sometimes, but it's just an amazing card to threaten with these Shield Blast creatures, where it just makes it so difficult. Like if your opponent attacks and you drop an Arbiter or a Militia, and then you just drop a BBP on them off of that bait out of nowhere, like that can be devastating. On top of that, when the pace of the game slows down, if you're playing against control decks, you're accumulating extra resources with a Keeper of Laws. Blinder Beetle Prime is the card you want to draw into to blow out the board state and push through blockers and things like that. So the rest of the cards, Salvation Reckoner, or more recent edition, and I think it's just a great addition. I mean, another card that's kind of clunky, but it gives you another good draw, like another Blinder Beetle effect for the later game, which can be a nice way to cap off a curve, like especially if you curve a bunch of stuff into a Keeper of Laws and then you have Salvation Reckoner to remove a blocker out of the way. That's great, and of course it's just an amazing Shield Blast. The mini Arbiter just still does a great job, and you can evolve on it with Prism Blade, so that's great too. So I think this just adds like the full 12 blasts plus the Prism Blade plus all these blockers too, the incidental blockers. Like your game against any kind of attacking deck is just so strong in my opinion. Again, like maybe it is a little more clunky. All the defensive expensive cards, some of the evolutions can be clunky in and of themselves, as opposed to just playing like the low curve, fast attack, heavy rush decks. So I think your game is a little more inconsistent and a little clunkier, easier to pick apart than for like the more reactive decks, which is the downside. But your game is just so like you have so many things going for you against any kind of aggressive matchup. Arbiter, of course, just amazing bomb, Shield Blast, and Storm Spark 2 just wins games. So those are pretty clear inclusions. Talked about Citadel Judge, why I don't really like it. Containment Field, I think, is probably a reasonable card, actually. Like, it's a 4-mana interactive card similar to Salvation Reckoner, but I just think I wanted the Blast of Reckoner better, like, or I wanted this more. Just the Creature Blast I felt was really nice, which is why I wanted that card. It's got less downside to it. But Containment Field has some nice applications. It's just like that kind of cheap Storm Spark Blast to break through multiple blockers. So maybe in certain metagames where blocker-heavy decks are more common or something like that, I mean, you still have Storm Spark and Blinder Beetle to make up that ground, so I don't think it's something you super need, but it could be a nice card to have access to. Maybe if you're playing more Commissarosauruses too, like that can be a good thing to utilize that board state with. So could be something. It's definitely one of the closer cards to this list. Sparkblade Protector, definitely a card. Maybe you could play one of or something like that. Like I don't know, maybe you want more evolutions, just that extra little bit of redundancy, because the 4-drop evolution can be pretty key in certain matchups, but those matchups are probably more like the aggro racing matchups, and those are already like your really good ones. So I don't really know if you need more Spark Blades to drop on like turn 4 against those decks. I think I'm fine with this configuration, and again, like I don't know, maybe it's better against something like dragons too, like just having that extra big body to evolve on to attack through heralds and stuff. I could see maybe a Sparkblade 1 or 2 copies might have been correct. And again, I think these 4 slots are probably the most flex in the deck at this point. So I would consider, like, these cards are definitely still on the table, but it depends. I think there are more meta choices. Commissarsaurus, again, another card, like if I wanted more 2-drops, this would be the way to go, or maybe just play a vanilla Enforcer bait too. Like either of these 2-drops, maybe it's better to just have the Enforcer, especially if you play more protectors, but I think the ability to just drop this power boost out of nowhere, I think, can be really relevant. So I'm not really sure where I'll fall at the end of the day. Definitely not playing this card, but these I think are all on the table for me. So that is my current build of Mono Light. Hopefully I did a good job explaining the deck as a whole. I think there's definitely a lot of tuning to do with the archetype. I think more exploration for sure, figuring out some of these cards, how good they are. Cards like Saurus and Militia, even Prison Blade, never really got like a good look in competitive play, like Reckoner as well. These are all cards that came out towards the end of the game. Mono Light, of course, was a deck that was played the most prevalent in the seasons before rotation, of course. A lot of the key cards coming from there. So as always, thank you for watching. Give me some feedback on the deck. If you liked it, if you enjoyed the profile, if you had your own cards you preferred or your own build you prefer. Always love to hear that kind of feedback. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.